Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 28th of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with Kherson with Antonov Bridge, where the Ukrainians, as a result of very fierce battles and storming operations, managed to establish a bridgehead on the Russian side of Dnipro River. On the islands. Currently the Russians can't do anything with this bridgehead. The only thing the Russians can do is just to slow down the Ukrainians, because just from, well, let's take a look at facts. The closest Russian positions are located in Oleshki, safe Russian positions where they can hide artillery systems, mortar systems, and so on. And using this settlement they can attack the Ukrainian positions, and for these purposes they need to attack and the distance between the, let's say, Oleshki, the closest distance between Oleshki and the Ukrainian positions is around like 3.77 kilometers. And when talking about, and you need to understand that the only possible solution for the Russians how to see the Ukrainians is using drones and so on. So this is the, and maybe satellite video or something like this. But when talking about the Ukrainians, the distance between their positions and the Russian positions in this area is around 1.45 kilometers, so twice as less in comparison with the Russians. And basically the Ukrainians don't need drones, they don't need anything to see and to follow the Russians and to see Russian movements. So there is no even chances for the Russians to hold this territory. Anyway, sooner or later the Russians will be forced to step back. Probably the Russians have already started this process, but they can't do this because the same reason that Ukrainians controls the supply and support roads that goes from Oleshki to Antonov Bridge. The Ukrainians continue increasing the number of their forces on this bridgehead. The level of water goes down, and believe me, in a month this is going to be a very powerful fortifications that will be under Ukrainian control. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of artillery duels and fightings on this bridgehead, Kherson bridgehead, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles, and 3 artillery systems. As you can see, according to these numbers, the level of losses of the Ukrainian forces have been increased, at least for the previous 24 hours, and I believe that mainly this situation is connected with the battle for Antonov Bridge, and this is the reason why the Ukrainians' losses have been increased during the previous 24 hours. Now we are moving further, and we are going to talk about Zaporozhye front line. We got a lot of updates from this territory. When we're going to start with Petykhatki. As you can see, I have updated this map according to the information that was provided by the Russian sources. Today the Russians published the video how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions all over the bridgehead in the vicinity of Lobkov and Petykhatki. There are going to be a lot of like video episodes from different places, from different like perspective, from different views, but the main thing is that the Russians were trying to attack, the Ukrainians were trying to slow down during the previous weeks, days, and they were bombing the settlements like Lobkova, they were bombing Petykhatki, they were bombing the fields, the roads, they were bombing the small settlement Kamyansky, the Russian part at least of Kamyansky, they were bombing Stepova. The Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions all over the front line and all over the bridgehead in the vicinity of these settlements. The Russians also published the piece of information that Ukrainians during the previous night, starting from 4 a.m. of the local time, made at least a few waves of attacks in direction of Zherebyanki. There was attack in direction of Petykhatki in Zherebyanki, and also there was another attack in direction somewhere at night, and as a result of that attack the Ukrainians lost at least 3 tanks and around 3 armored personnel carriers. Later they made another attack, and as a result of that attack the Ukrainians also were defeated, and the Ukrainians lost 1 platoon and few armored vehicles. So the Ukrainians continue advancing, continue trying to push the Russians, and currently we see that situation develops in Ukrainian favor, but I won't be so sure for this, because currently the Ukrainian situation, the Ukrainian offensive operation gets into critical phase. Not about the question whether the Ukrainians are able to penetrate or they will lose their manpower and so on. No, the critical phase of any offensive operation, as you can see based on this map, we see that the main direction of Ukrainian attack, let's say from Lobkova to Lugovo, so very deep inside of Russian defense belt, and from the other side we see that the Ukrainians Ukrainians still haven't solved the issue with the South Kamyansky village, this residential area, and of course, let's call it with the eastern flank of Petykhatki. The Ukrainians are digging in very deep, and they still haven't solved the issue with the western and the eastern flanks. So basically, the Ukrainians by themselves are creating the cauldron for themselves by getting very deep inside the Russians' defense belt. And basically, currently we see that the combat line is as follows. And if the Ukrainians want to get success, they need to attack currently in every single direction. They need to develop the bridgehead synchronously in every single direction, because if they will choose just one direction, then they can got into a cauldron that they prepared by themselves. But to develop the bridgehead synchronously in every single direction, for these purposes, you need to have a lot of manpower, a lot of forces accumulated in this area. And this is a very risky to accumulate a lot of forces in Petykhatki and Lapkovo, because these are very small settlements where the Ukrainians don't have just positions to hide. If they want to accumulate forces, that means that they need to make, let's say, 6 or 7 waves of attacks. So one wave attack goes, then an hour later another wave, another later another wave, and like 7 waves in a row. And this will allow the Ukrainians to, and the most important in these attacks is to have 100% sure that Ukrainians are able to develop their bridgehead in every single direction after every single wave. If they can't develop the bridgehead after every single wave, the only thing they will do by these waves is they will accumulate their forces inside of artillery bag. Another important thing about this bridgehead, if you take a look at this area, we see that the entire Ukrainian offensive operation depends just on one city. I will add this city to the map using, let's say, different color, using green color. So the entire Ukrainian offensive operation depends on a small settlement by the name of Stepove. So this is logistic hub, logistic bridgehead that Ukrainians use to send reserves. So for example, the Ukrainians send their forces to Mali Sherbaki, then to Stepove, and after Stepove their forces appears in Petykhatki. Let's say this is the central and this eastern supply road. The second way is through Kamyansky, using the safe supply roads. They are sending their forces also to Petykhatki and Lapkovo, so western and the eastern flanks. And basically, according to this configuration, we see that if the Ukrainians will start offensive operation with the attempt to dig deeper inside the Russian defense belt, the only thing that the Russians need somehow to attack Stepove. So, for example, from Konovalovka, using the supply roads, using the trenches, forest lines, to cut this road, and after that or somewhere from these directions to go further to Stepove. And if the Russians somehow are able to establish control over this small settlement, then they will ruin the entire Ukrainian offensive operation, and they will encircle the entire Ukrainian army. Of course, we understand that it's a very difficult operation, and I'm trying to analyze and trying to understand what the Russians can do in this case. And as I see, using tanks, I believe it's going to be a suicide operation if the Russians will send forces using tanks along the fields. First, it will take a lot of time, and the second, they will go into minefields, and the Ukrainians will discover this operation, and basically they will change their plans. And after that, if they see this, they will attack the Russians in their flank from Petykhatki, and they will basically encircle the Russian forces who try to encircle the Ukrainian forces. The only solution I see is to send, let's call it a small helicopter operation, like VDV operation. It's like maybe crazy operation, but to send forces to Stepove to capture the settlement and to wait until the main Russian forces arise from Konovalovka on the eastern flank to the settlement is the best solution for the Russian to encircle the Ukrainian forces in Petykhatki, Lapkovo. And you need to understand that currently the Russians think and try to create something like this. I just provide you an example what the Russians can do, how the Russians can solve the issue with Petykhatki. just to allow the Ukrainians to get as deep as possible inside this bridgehead. And of course, the direction of attack that the Russians can use is on the south of Kamyansky to the east and just to encircle the Ukrainian forces. Believe me, currently the Russians are trying to create something like this, and basically the Russians maybe even will allow the Ukrainians to develop a little bit to the south, to the west, and to the east, and after that they will try to encircle and to create a cauldron of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade and 130th Reconnaissance Battalion, probably the forces of 65th Mechanized Brigade. So this is the situation about Petykhatki, and very soon the situation is going to be resolved in this area, because the situation becomes critical either for the Ukrainians and for the Russians. For the Russians is that they are losing their bridgehead, and for the Ukrainians is they're getting deep very inside of this defense belt without solving problems and issues with the flanks. Now we are moving to Orekhov. The Russians reported that they destroyed today the artillery ammo depot of 47th Artillery Brigade in Novopavlovka. They also destroyed some Ukrainian positions and forces in Orekhov. And today the Ukrainians published the video how using drones they attacked the Russians' positions in the north of Robotina. This is Russian tank, and using drones the Ukrainians making few attempts were trying to attack, but probably there was a very powerful wind, and so that's why this drone couldn't destroy the tank from the first attempt. Anyway, this confirms that the Russians still controls the northern the defense belt in front of Orekhov, in front of Bradley Square. And to tell the truth, I tried to analyze this bridge. I tried to combine different tactics and different approaches that either the Ukrainians and the Russians can use to develop and to break entire situation, and to tell the truth, I couldn't find any. I'm not saying that this is a useless waste of manpower from the Ukrainian side, but for now I still haven't understand the Ukrainian plans and the real purposes of this attack on meet walls, meet attacks on the Russians against the Russians towards the Russians defense belt. Because for example, today the Ukrainians made more attempts to attack in direction of Robotina. All those attacks were repelled one more time, and the Ukrainians haven't achieved any success, any results, and one more time they were forced to step back. Maybe this is some kind of fake attack trying to force the Russians to accumulate their forces and reserves, and meanwhile the Ukrainians are trying to develop their offensive operation bridgehead in the vicinity of Petykhatki. Maybe, but we see that Ukrainians still haven't achieved anything, and they have paid for, even for these small forest lines, for the fields, of too big price. Now we are moving further to Mifka tactical bridgehead. Before that, a few updates that Ukrainians bombed railroad station in Pologi, and the Russians discovered and destroyed Ukrainians commandos platoon in the vicinity on Marfapol. Now we are getting to the Mifka tactical bridgehead. Today the Russians published another video how they destroyed with helicopters a very big convoy of Ukrainian forces who were heading in direction of fields, in direction of Piryutin, Stara Mlynovka, Kermenchik. This is a very fresh video, and as a result of helicopter attack, the Ukrainians lost indeed the really big convoy of their forces. And as you can see in this video, like few tanks and armored vehicles were heading later using missiles. The Russians destroyed armored vehicles. The tanks turned around, turned to the left, to the right, and got into minefields and was destroyed as well. And this video was geolocated, and the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Makarovka. So those attacks took place on this bridgehead, and the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian forces who were heading on this small road between Starozhovo and Makarovka. And this is another reason why I suggested this idea with helicopters on the combat line in the vicinity of like Petykhatki, because we see that the Russians do have possibilities to use their helicopters very close to the combat line, and the Ukrainians still haven't destroyed even a single helicopter. At least they haven't provided us any video or photo confirmation. Meanwhile, the Russians have already published dozens of videos how they were using helicopters and they were destroying the Ukrainians' armored vehicles. So as I understand that the Russians do have possibilities to fly on the very low hay, very close to the combat lines. So for them it will, I'm not sure it's going to be a very big deal to send the helicopters with some marines to that settlement and just to encircle the Ukrainians in Petykhatki. But for some reason they're not doing this, at least yet. Now let's talk a little bit more about Vremivka. We got a lot of updates. The Russians also published the video how the Ukrainians somewhere in the Vremivka tactical bridgehead were trying to penetrate the Russians' defense belt using armored vehicles who were moving along the fields, and these vehicles got onto minefields, and they're starting explosions one by one. So as a result of that attack, 3 armored vehicles got onto minefields and 3 of them were destroyed. The Russian blogger, military expert Rybor, reported that as a result of offensive operation in the south of Rovnopol, the Ukrainians managed to develop their bridgehead to the south, and as I understand, basically we need more information, we need more piece of information to confirm this, but as I understand, the Ukrainians as a result of attack managed to establish control over the first defense belt in front of Rovnopol, and currently the Ukrainians continue advancing to the south in direction of fields between Переютne and Staromayorskaya. And the main important thing that I mentioned from report of that blogger is that Ukrainians currently, as I see, took a decision not to attack in direction of settlements itself. So not to attack, let's say, from Makarovka to Staromayorsk, and we discussed this many times. The main reason of not using these tactics is that the Russian positions are located on the hills. The Ukrainians lost a lot of vehicles in Makarovka as a result of Russian artillery fire and helicopter fire. So basically the Ukrainians are no longer want to continue moving along the river in Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, but the Ukrainians start using very interesting tactics. As you can see, the Ukrainians are trying to use the fields among the fields to the south, and basically while moving to the south, they took a decision to mine the fields, to establish their own mine fields on the flanks of the settlement. So as you can see, the Ukrainians move to the south, they're trying to attack, and they're trying to establish control over the next defense belt. This is the next defense belt. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians are mining the fields between their road of attack and the settlements like Makarovka, Staromayorsk. And the main reason of that is, of course, not to allow the Russians to make a counter-attacks to the flanks, because if the Russians start attacks, they will go onto Ukrainian minefields and they will be destroyed as well. So basically, as I understand, if we will continue these tactics, if we will make some kind of projections and speculation about these tactics, we see that in the same situation the Ukrainians are trying to develop on the eastern flank, and as you can see, the Ukrainians are attacking the Russians, are moving to the south, and their main purpose, the main target is to attack Staromlynovka, and the Ukrainians are not attacking inside of Urozhaine because of the same reason that these settlements are located in the lowland. They are attacking a little bit to the east of these settlements, but from the other side we see that Ukrainians also try to mine using the distance mining method the territory that's located between Urozhaine, let's say, and the Ukrainians attack road, this one. So they are trying to move to the south, and they demand the western flank with one purpose, not to allow the Russians to counterattack them from, let's say, Urozhaine and into the flank of Ukrainian forces who are heading to the south. And basically, if we will do the same now in the vicinity of Staromayorsk, and if the Ukrainians somehow is able to continue their advancing to the south in direction of Staromlynovka, they will continue using the same tactics, and they will try to mine the fields between the Ukrainian attack road and, let's say, the settlements like Makarovka, Staromayorsk, Urozhaine, and Staromlynovka. And now you see that Ukrainians are trying to attack Staromlynovka from both sides, and furthermore they're trying to mine the fields between their attack roads and the Russian positions along the river with one purpose: to create a cauldron. For example, the Russians can't attack to the north in direction of Makarovka because there are Ukrainian positions. They're not in a very good positions, but anyway, these are Ukrainian positions, and of course any attack from the Russian side to the north will be defeated and the Russians will have losses. The Russians can step back, and they will step back because they can't attack to the west or to the east, because these fields are mined or will be mined during the Ukrainian attack to the south. And the only possible solutions for the Russians is to go to the south. If they will stay in Mayorska, and if the Ukrainians are able to bypass the fields, of course they will close the head of Cauldron and by blocking the roads on the north of Mlynovka, and the Russians in the settlements will appear in Cauldron. So this is the situation. About this is probably not the classical, this is the base of the possible Ukrainian tactics in direction of Mlynovka, to try to penetrate, bypass the fields and to mine the flanks from the Russians' flanks attacks. And if the Ukrainians can do this, some Russian forces can be appeared in Cauldron, or they will be forced to step back to the Mlynovka and to leave these settlements, like Urozhaina, Mlynovka, without even a battle or even a fight, because they don't have any other option to do anything. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings in the vicinity of Petykhatki, in the vicinity of Bradley Square, Orekhov, and Vremivka tactical bridgehead, the Ukrainians lost 235 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks and 2 artillery systems. As you can see, the level of losses have been increased in comparison with the previous day, and mainly this increase is connected with the fierce fightings in Petykhatki and on the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. The Ukrainians continue accumulation their forces. Some sources are saying that Ukrainians have moved their plans to relaunch the offensive operation somewhere on the 5th or 6th of July, but some sources are saying that maybe they will start this night. Very difficult to understand, and everything depends on weather, and everything depends on the summit, NATO summit in the Baltic states. Now we are moving to Uldar front line. We got also a lot of updates. If you remember yesterday, I just mentioned that the Russians stopped publishing any videos of their artillery attacks against the Uldar bridgehead, and today probably somebody heard my words and published the first video probably since the March of April. A small explosion somewhere in coal mines in the vicinity of Uldar. Not a very big explosion, probably using some kind of artillery shell like Krasnopol. The Russians destroy ammo depot, or maybe just some fuel truck or armored vehicles somewhere in the vicinity of Uldar, somewhere in the vicinity of small settlement between Uldar and Vadiana in this area. Interesting updates are coming from north of Novomykhailovka. If you remember, the Russians recently established control over these trenches, Ukrainian trenches, and after that they took a small operational pause that took around a few days, 2 days, and currently the Russian sources are saying that the Russians launched another offensive operation in this area, trying to develop the bridgehead in the vicinity of Pobeda and in the vicinity of Novomykhailovka and the recently gained territories. This is a very dangerous operation from the Russian side, and believe me, if the Russians, the entire success even of Vremivka operation completely depends on the Russian success in the vicinity of Novomykhailovka and Pobeda. And if the Russians do have possibility with a normal speed to develop their bridgeheads to the south of Novomykhailovka and to the west of Pobeda, believe me, the Ukrainians will be forced to start sending their strategical or tactical reserves from Velika Novoselovka and Vremivka tactical bridgehead exactly in the vicinity of Novomykhailovka with one purpose: to stop the Russians and not to allow them to develop the bridgehead. This is a very critical situation for the Ukrainians, because if the Russians do have possibility and if the Russians are able to establish control over this part of the bridgehead, of course we understand that after that we can start counting days before Uldar, Vadiana, Marinka is going to fall. And we see that the Russians have some advances in this area, and the initiative is under complete Russian control in the vicinity of Novomykhailovka, Pobeda, and Marinka. The Russians reported that during the previous day they repelled Ukrainian attacks in the vicinity of Pervomaiska, in the vicinity of Veselaya. The total losses of the Ukrainians on Donetsk front line, including the Ukrainians' losses in Artyomovsk, were around 240 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system Crema. And when talking about Artyomovsk, the situation sometimes at some parts of the front line develops in Ukrainian favor. As we discussed in the previous video, the Ukrainians to be more precise, the 24th Mechanized Brigade, as a result of fierce fighting and storming operation, managed to force the Russians to leave this side of the channel, and the Russians were forced to step back every single fortification on this side, on the western side of the channel, and they moved to Kurdyumovka. Also, the Ukrainians published the video how they established the Ukrainian flag exactly in this area right in front of Kurdyumovka. Now, the Russians are saying that they're making a counter argument, saying that all these fields is full of Ukrainian bodies, and they published few videos confirming that, but it was just few videos anyway. We see that currently, when talking about the ground, when talking about the territory that is under Russian-Ukraine control, we see that currently the situation in Artyomovsk develops in Ukraine's favor. After 21st of May, the Russians haven't established control over a single square meter on Artyomovsk bridgehead, and the Ukrainians have already returned significant number of fields, supply roads, and if months ago the Ukrainians have just one supply road through Ivanovska, currently the Ukrainians have a lot of supply roads in Ivanovska, to the south of Ivanovska, this road 0506, the road from Bogdanovka in direction of Yagid. So the Ukrainians have developed significant bridgehead, and currently they can continue advancing. The only question whether they have enough of manpower to do this or not, because believe me, they have a lot of losses in the ratio plays in Russian favor, and I don't think that the Ukrainians have the ratio the same as Wagner's had during their storming operation. I believe that nothing have changed since that Wagner operation, and the ratio is still placed in Russian favor, even if there are no Wagners in Artyomovsk or Bakhmut. The Ukrainians continue, as we discussed, sending reserves from strategical part. They are sending recently redeployed the force of 22nd Mechanized Brigade, and the main purpose probably to replace or to reinforce the force of 77th, 56th and 57th brigades. Furthermore, we discussed in the previous video and the day before, the Russians made a very powerful missile attack against Kramatorsk. The Ukrainians are saying that as a result of the attack, a lot of civilians were killed, but we saw, I believe everybody have already seen this video, and there are a lot of foreign mercenaries, foreign volunteers. There are a lot of soldiers from the United States brigades, like 3rd Battalion, like from 101st Division, and so on. And there are a lot of English speech in these videos, and the soldiers, the officers were saying that a lot of soldiers were buried under the ruins in Kramatorsk. That was a very powerful attack, and these Russian sources are saying that as a result of that strike, the Ukrainians lost a lot of officers, NATO soldiers, NATO officers, up to generals. It was one of the, when talking about the Russians, it was one of the best attacks since the beginning of the special military operation. Now we are moving further to Sivers Bridge. The Ukrainians launched a series of counter-offensive operations in direction of Saka Ivanseti, and the Russians published the video of that attack. Basically, the Ukrainians sent personal armored carriers as close as possible to the combat line. Then the Marines left the carriers and started attacking the Russian trenches. After that, the soldiers were covered by artillery fire, and as a result, the entire attack was defeated, and the Ukrainians, having significant losses, were forced to step back. So basically, Sakhan-Vanseti remains under Russian control. The Russians also reported they attacked the positions of 110th Mountain Assault Brigade in the vicinity of Veselaya. And now we are getting to Liman front line. We haven't received any video, any geolocated video from this bridgehead. So as we can see, no changes on the ground. The Russians report they attacked positions of 21st, 42nd, 63rd and 67th Brigade in Nevska and Terny in the vicinity of Dubrova and in the vicinity of Kuzmine, but as you can see, without any changes on the ground. The total losses of the Ukrainians were around 115 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems. When talking about Kupiansk front line, no changes on the ground. Tomorrow we are going to discuss some redeployment changes on this front line, and the total loss of the Ukrainians were around 30 soldiers. This is all about Ukraine. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about Wagner's and Prigozhin. Very interesting piece of information we got today. The Russians sources are saying that Prigozhin currently is in Moscow. His forces is in the vicinity of Osipovich in Belarus, but Prigozhin himself is in Moscow and he has some negotiations with the Russian authorities. For now, we don't know the exact topic these people discussed, like Vladimir Putin, the president of Russian Federation, Prigozhin, and Shoigu, the Minister of Defense. Probably there are more people who are involved in this conversation, but the thing is that this update about conversation with Moscow appeared almost at the same time when we got very interesting update that the president of Poland and the leaders of Baltic states visited Kiev today. They had talks with it was an official, unannounced visit today, and basically, as I understand, the president of Ukraine and the leaders of Poland and Baltic states were talking about the July events that are going to take place in the end of July. And I'm talking about that some sources are saying that in the end of July, the Poland and the Baltic states are planning to move and redeploy in the western part of Ukraine a few Poland and Baltic states brigades. It's going to be 2 brigades. The first one is going to be redeployed in the end of July, and the second one in the end of August and in the beginning of September. And as I understand, the Wagners were redeployed to Belarus exactly for these purposes. As I understand, if you remember, Prigozhin told us that the Wagners are going to return back to Ukraine on the 5th of August, but everybody will be surprised where exactly Wagners are going to be redeployed. But basically about the situation with Belarus, as I understand, by the end of July, Wagners will be redeployed to the Brest region, and basically Wagners will enter if Poland and the Baltic states brigades will cross the Ukrainian border and they enter the western part of Ukraine. I understand that Wagners will be sent to the western part of Ukraine and they will do the same. So basically, maybe there is a very high chances, and according to rumors and talks we have right now from the Ukrainian side and from the Russian side, we see that maybe in the end of July and the beginning of August, we're going to see the battle between the Polish and Baltic states brigades with Wagners in the vicinity of Kovel. This settlement is located very close to the Belarus border, and that's why the Russians will have enough of power and resources to supply their forces in this area. And also the settlement is located very close to Poland, so that's why the same situation from the Poland side. They will be able to support their brigades, and basically we are going to see another Artyomovsk or Bakhmut, but probably in the western part of Ukraine. And this is going to be not like Artyomovsk or Bakhmut, this is going to be Kovel, the very important logistic hub that Wagners will try to capture and to force the Polish forces to step back from this territory. So this is the reason why the Russians have redeployed the nuclear weapon on the territory of Belarus, because we understand that the Wagners will be supplied and supported from the territory of Belarus. This is the only possible solution, and of course this is going to be a very tasty piece of cake for the Poland forces and Ukrainians to start attacking the Russians, the Belarus military infrastructure on the territory of Brest, like to reduce the supply and support of Wagners. And for these purposes, the Russians, Belarus have nuclear weapon as the shield, as the main shield to prevent any any attempts from the Western countries to attack the territory of Belarus. But from the other side, I think that also the same story works in Poland. It's going to be a very tough situation, I believe so, but as I understand, according to information I have, this is going to be exactly like this. Furthermore, today the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, told us that if NATO is a powerful alliance, then they must declare that if at least one leg of the Wagnerian appears on the territory of Poland or Lithuania, then the entire Wagner will be destroyed, whatever it is. And everything, one more times, everybody are talking about the western part of Ukraine, and currently they're trying to create rules of that battle or something like this. This is going to be very interesting and very bloody, as I understand. And that's it for today. The Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.